The last thing I remembered was the tape. It was thick, industrial-grade packing tape, the kind my brother used to seal up boxes of hunting gear he never actually used. I remembered the sound of it ripping off the roll, that sharp, tearing noise that seemed to go on forever. I remembered my mother's hands on my shoulders, pressing me down into the kitchen floor. I remembered my father's knees digging into my legs, keeping me still. I remembered my sister-in-law standing over me, her belly swollen with the golden child, her face twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. And I remembered my nephew. Zach was 5 years old. He was standing in the doorway, watching everything with those big, curious eyes. He wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He was just watching. "Hold her legs," my mother said. "I am holding her legs," my father replied. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was helping someone move furniture. "Tighter. She's still moving. She's always moving. That's the problem." I tried to scream. I tried to thrash. But the tape was already around my wrists, around my ankles, around my mouth. Every time I managed to twist free, another strip of tape was slapped over the gap. "Don't waste the tape," my sister-in-law said. "That stuff's expensive." "Zach," my brother called from somewhere behind me. "Come here, buddy. You don't need to watch this." "No," the little voice said. "I want to watch." I looked up at him through the haze of tears and panic. He was so small, so innocent. He didn't understand what was happening. He couldn't possibly understand. Then he smiled. And I knew he understood exactly what was happening. I knew he'd been told exactly what to expect. I knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any knife, that my family had been planning this for a long time. "You're almost there, buddy," my brother said, and I couldn't tell if he was talking to his son or to me. "Just a little longer." "Am I gonna get the house?" Zach asked. "After she's gone," my sister-in-law said. "It's yours. All of it. All of it. All of it. The apartment, the savings, the retirement fund, everything." "Everything," Zach repeated, tasting the word like candy. "And I can buy whatever I want." "Anything you want." He smiled again. Wider this time. "Okay." And then he turned to me, that 5-year-old face full of nothing but anticipation. "You can go now, Aunt Vera," he said. "We're done with you." I remember the feeling of the tape pressing against my mouth, suffocating me. I remember the weight of my father's knees, the pressure of my mother's hands. I remember looking up at them, my family, the people who were supposed to love me, and seeing nothing but patience. They were waiting for me to stop breathing. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to ask how they could do this, how they could look at their daughter, their sister, their sister-in-law, and see nothing but a problem to be eliminated. I wanted to scream that I'd given them everything. My savings, my salary, my time, my youth. I'd worked my whole life to make them proud, and they'd only ever used me. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I could only watch as my mother leaned down and whispered in my ear. "Don't worry, honey. You won't feel a thing soon. And think how happy Zach will be. Don't you want him to be happy?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw my way out of this nightmare. But my body was already giving up, the edges of my vision going dark, the sounds of their voices fading into a distant hum. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was my nephew's voice, small and bright. "She's really quiet now. Is she gone yet?" I died on my kitchen floor. I died surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me. I died with a 5-year-old watching, counting down the seconds until he could claim his inheritance. And then I woke up. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Not the buzzing of fluorescent lights or the hum of hospital equipment. I'd expected that, somehow. No, it was the sound of my sister-in-law screaming at the top of her lungs, and the sound of my mother shrieking with excitement, and the sound of my brother clapping like a seal at a water park. "I got it! I got it! I got it!" Melissa's voice was so high-pitched it could shatter glass. She was waving her phone in the air like she'd just won the lottery, which, in her mind, she had. $39. $39 for a 7-day European tour. 5 of us, $195. That's it. That's the whole price. My mother grabbed the phone from her, squinting at the screen. Let me see that. $39 for Europe. That can't be right. That's less than a pair of shoes. Mom, it's a government subsidy program. Melissa said, with the confident authority of someone who had just learned a new word and was determined to use it as often as possible. The government pays for the rest. It's for cultural exchange. Educational purposes. We're going to be doing the economy a favor. My mother looked at the screen again, then at me. Vera, you're the one with the fancy law degree. What do you think? Is this legit? I opened my mouth. I was about to say the same thing I'd said in my first life. The same thing that had gotten me 6 years of blame, 6 years of servitude, 6 years of being told that I'd ruined everything because I'd tried to warn them. Mom, this is clearly a scam. You don't even need a passport for this European tour. That's not how international travel works. And the number of zeros on that price tag should be a red flag. I caught myself. The words died in my throat. And I remembered, crystal clear, like a movie playing in slow motion, what had happened the last time I'd said that. I remembered the resentment that had festered in Melissa's eyes for the next 6 years. I remembered the way she'd bring it up every time I did something she didn't like. If you hadn't stopped us from going on that trip, we'd be millionaires right now. I remembered my mother nodding along, my father pretending not to hear, and Zach, who wasn't even born yet when we'd had that first conversation, growing up to repeat the same refrain like a well-trained parrot. If Aunt Vera hadn't ruined our trip. Stop, I whispered. But no one heard me. They were too busy celebrating. $39, my father repeated, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just been handed a gift he didn't deserve. That's cheaper than a night out at the movies. It's cheaper than a night out at McDonald's, my brother chimed in. And we're going to Europe. We're going to Europe. Melissa shrieked, and she threw her arms around him, her pregnant belly pressing against his gut. The room dissolved into chaos. My mother was already calculating what she'd pack. My brother was trying to figure out if he could expense the trip as a business development opportunity. Melissa was on her phone, frantically Googling what to wear in Europe in the spring. And I sat there, still reeling from the shock of being alive, watching them celebrate their impending doom with all the enthusiasm of lemmings heading for a cliff. I knew what was waiting for them. I knew, because I'd seen it in my first life. The European tour wasn't European at all. It was a scam run by a shadowy network of criminals who preyed on the credulous and the cheap. The victims were driven to a rundown compound in the middle of nowhere, not Europe, but a fake replica of one, complete with a sign that said EuroVillage in peeling paint. The tour guides were kidnappers. The hotels were prisons. And the cultural experiences were carefully staged opportunities to drain the victims of every cent they had. The lucky ones came back with nothing but debt and trauma. The unlucky ones didn't come back at all. My family, my mother, my father, my brother, my sister-in-law, and the unborn child she carried, were headed straight into the mouth of that trap. And this time, I wasn't going to stop them. Vera, Melissa's voice cut through the noise, sharp and demanding. You're going to be our photographer, right? And you can carry my bags, too. I'm pregnant, I can't be hauling luggage all over Europe. I looked at her. Looked at the way she was already taking me for granted, assuming that I would drop everything to serve her. Looked at the way my mother was nodding along, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Looked at my brother, who was already scrolling through his phone, looking for flights he wouldn't need to book. A flicker of my old self stirred inside me, desperate to speak up, to warn them, to save them. I crushed it. Actually, I said, and my voice came out calm and even, I don't think I can go. The room went silent. Every head swiveled toward me. Every eye narrowed. What do you mean, you can't go? Melissa's voice had gone from shriek to ice. We need you there. Who's going to carry my bags? Who's going to take the pictures? My mother added. Who's going to be the designated sober person? My brother asked, and I could tell from the tone of his voice that he'd been expecting me to be the family's pack mule from the very beginning. "I'm sorry," I said, and I made sure my voice was dripping with fake regret. "I've got a huge case coming up. The firm is expecting me to lead it. If I take time off now, I'll lose the opportunity." "Opportunity?" Melissa's eyes narrowed. "What kind of opportunity?" "Big one," I said, keeping my face completely neutral. $30,000 in commissions. If I close it. The number landed like a bomb. 30,000. For a family that had been scraping by on my salary for years, 30,000 might as well have been a winning lottery ticket. "When do you get paid?" my mother asked, her tone shifting from accusation to calculation in the span of a second. "End of the quarter," I lied. "If I don't take any time off." The gears were turning behind everyone's eyes. I could practically see the math. 30,000 minus the gambling debts minus the loans minus the credit card bills minus. "We'll manage without you," Melissa said abruptly. Too abruptly. Like she was afraid I'd change my mind. "You stay and make the money. We'll take lots of pictures so you can see what you missed." She didn't say it, but I knew what she was thinking. It'll be nice to have a family vacation without the spare tire for once. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. I quickly suppressed it. "Are you sure?" I asked, making my voice as small and plaintive as possible. "I don't want to let you down." "You're not letting us down," my mother said, patting my hand. "You're helping the family. That's what matters." Helping the family. Right. The same way I'd been helping the family all along. By being the designated caregiver, the designated breadwinner, the designated scapegoat. The one who gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left. And then, when I was finally empty, well, I'd seen what happened to empty people. "I'll miss you guys," I said, and I made my eyes just a little bit shiny. "Have a great time. Take lots of pictures. And don't worry about me, I'll be fine here." Melissa was already on her phone, tapping out an Instagram post. "Europe, here I come. #blessed #travel #French girl style." I looked at her carefully curated life, all the filters and angles and carefully chosen moments that hid the mess underneath, and felt that smile creep back up. They were so excited. They were so happy. They had no idea what was waiting for them. And I wasn't going to be the one to tell them. Not this time. This time, they'd figure it out on their own. Or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. I turned and walked back to my room. I closed the door behind me, leaned against it, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Outside, I could hear Melissa shrieking about packing. My mother was asking if she could bring her own snacks. My brother was trying to figure out how to get his hunting knife through customs. And I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the blank wall in front of me. I was back. I was alive. They were heading straight into the trap I'd tried to warn them about in my first life. And I wasn't going to lift a finger to save them. I thought about the tape and the floor and my nephew's smiling face. I thought about my mother's hands and my father's knees and my sister-in-law's cold, careful eyes. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn their love, trying to be good enough, trying to prove that I was worth more than the scraps they threw me. And I thought about the one thing they'd made perfectly clear, over and over again. I was never going to be enough. They'd made their choice. They'd always been making it. And this time, I was going to let them live with it. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful. It was the kind of beauty I'd never noticed before. And I was going to see it for a long, long time. Because I was free. I was finally, completely free. The next 3 days were a masterclass in delusion. Melissa's social media accounts became a 24/7 broadcast of her European adventure before it had even started. Every post was a carefully curated masterpiece of self-deception. Day 1. 2 days until Europe. OMG, I can't sleep, I'm so excited. #travel #blessed finally. The photo showed her holding her fake designer handbag against the backdrop of her own living room, which she'd managed to angle so it looked like a hotel lobby. Day 2. Getting into the European mindset with some French coffee. Teacup with handle hash, from Starbucks, but it's the vibe that counts, right? Hash Europe bound hash coffee hash travelgram. The coffee cup sat on her bathroom counter, her half-finished skincare routine visible in the background. She'd clearly spent more time staging the photo than she ever spent drinking the coffee. Day 3. Packed and ready, airplane hash Europe, here we come. Hash vacation mode hash family time hash dream cometru. A suitcase sat open on the bed, overflowing with clothes that were clearly too small for the climate she'd actually be visiting. She'd packed for Paris in the spring, light cardigans, sundresses, a pair of white pants that were already wrinkled. My mother, who had never traveled farther than the next state over, was frantically trying to figure out what the French ate for breakfast. I heard they eat croissants, she said, scrolling through her phone. Should I bring some granola bars in case I don't like them? The trip includes 3 meals a day, my brother said, not looking up from his video game. You won't need granola bars. It's a cultural exchange, Melissa added confidently. We're supposed to eat what they eat. And what do they eat? Whatever they eat, Melissa said, as if that answered everything. My father had retreated into his usual silence, watching the chaos unfold with the weary detachment of a man who'd long ago stopped trying to control anything. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer opinions. He just waited for it all to be over. I was in my room, listening to the chaos through the walls, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The high-interest debt collectors showed up 2 days before they left. It was the middle of the afternoon. I was in the kitchen, pretending to work on a case file, when I heard the doorbell ring. Then again. Then a third time, this one followed by a heavy fist pounding on the wood. Harvey! Open the door. My brother's face went white. He'd been in the middle of a game, but he dropped the controller like it had burned him. Who's that? I'm not sure, I said, even though I knew exactly who it was. I'd been expecting them for weeks. Maybe you should see. No. You open it. It's your name they're calling. My mother shuffled into the living room, a dish towel in her hands. What's all the noise? She froze as the banging started again. Harvey! We know you're in there. Open this door or we're coming through it. Maybe you should open it, I repeated. Harvey's face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. No, they can't be here, they said I had another week. When did you tell them you'd pay? I was going to pay them with the money, he stopped, his eyes darting over to me. Then my mother. Then the door. You were going to pay them with what? I was going to use my share of he stopped again. I was going to use the money I was saving. From what? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The banging became more insistent. Something solid hit the door. I heard the sound of wood splintering. My mother was already reaching for her purse. How much is it? I can help. 6,000, my brother said quickly. Maybe 7. It's not 6,000, I said. It's 15. And with the interest, it's closer to 38. My mother's hand stopped moving. What? Harvey glared at me, his eyes burning. How do you know about that? I know a lot of things, Harvey. It was supposed to be a quick loan. You borrowed from the wrong people. That's not a quick loan. That's a death spiral. The door buckled. I didn't flinch. I'd been waiting for this moment. Not because I wanted to watch them suffer, but because I needed to see what they would do. When the walls started closing in, when the trap was set and the predators were circling, who would they look to first? I was curious. But I already knew the answer. The door burst open. 2 men stood in the entryway, broad-shouldered, shaved-headed, the kind of men who had nothing to prove because their existence was proof enough. One of them was holding a steel pipe. Harvey, he said, stepping over the threshold like he owned the place. I've been looking for you. My brother backpedaled so fast he tripped over the coffee table. I can pay you, I'm getting money soon, I've got a family trip coming up. I don't care about your family trip, the man said. I care about my money. Where is it? I don't have it right now. Then you're not leaving right now. He gestured to the second man, who came forward with a roll of duct tape. The sight of it hit me like a physical blow, the sharp ripping sound, the silver sheen, the way it glinted under the harsh living room light. For a moment, I was back on that kitchen floor, paralyzed, helpless, watching my nephew smile as the life drained out of me. I blinked. The vision passed. But the anger didn't. Wait, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Let me talk to them. Everyone froze. The man with the pipe turned to look at me. His eyes narrowed. Who's this? His sister, I said. The one who actually pays the bills in this house. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound. Lucky you. I didn't flinch. Harvey doesn't have your money. He never did. But he's about to go on a trip, a big one. And I'm going to tell you exactly where he's going to be. Harvey's eyes widened. Vera, don't. You don't need to collect the debt, I said, when you know exactly where to find the debtor. The man looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. Smart girl. He stepped back, motioning to his partner. They retreated through the shattered door, pausing just long enough to fix me with a look. I'll be seeing you, he said. All of you. The door didn't close behind them. The latch had been destroyed. The living room was silent. And I walked back to my room and called the locksmith. They left the next morning. I didn't go to the airport to see them off. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't cry, didn't wave, didn't pretend to be sad. I just stayed in my room and listened to the chaos of their departure through the walls. Harvey was still white as a sheet, checking every car that passed. My mother was babbling about the European cultural experience she was about to have, as if that would somehow make everything okay. Melissa was taking selfies on the way to the car. And my father was silent as always. Vera, my mother called through my door. Are you sure you don't want to come? I've got that case, I said, my voice perfectly neutral. Are you sure you're okay staying here all alone? Okay was a strong word. But I managed to keep my voice steady. I'll be fine. You go have your trip. Are you sure? We don't want you to feel left out. I smiled through the closed door. I'm okay, Mom. I really am. Because they had no idea what was waiting for them. And even if they did, they wouldn't believe me. They'd never believed me. They'd never believed anyone. They thought they were going to Europe. They thought they were going to have the time of their lives. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that they were walking straight into a nightmare. I waited until I heard the car pull out of the driveway. I waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. I waited until the house was completely, totally silent. Then I opened the door and walked out into the empty living room. The broken door was still broken. The coffee table was still overturned. The shattered glass from a picture frame was still scattered across the floor. They'd left me with a wrecked house. They'd left me with a broken door. They'd left me with all their problems. I looked around the room and I felt a strange sense of peace, as if that last trace of my guilt had finally evaporated. It was a relief I hadn't expected, a lightness in my chest that made me feel like I was floating. And I thought about all the years I'd spent being their scapegoat. I thought about the debt collectors and the empty promises and the way Harvey had looked at me like I was a walking ATM. I thought about the way Melissa had turned every conversation into a request. I thought about the way my mother had never once asked me what I wanted. I thought about the way my father had never once looked at me like I was anything other than a problem. And I made a promise to myself. This time, they were on their own. I spent the first day in complete silence. It took me a while to remember how to enjoy it. For years, the house had been filled with noise, Harvey's video games, my mother's soap operas, Melissa's endless phone calls, Zach's shrieking laughter. I'd gotten so used to the chaos that I'd forgotten what quiet felt like. The second day, I started cleaning. Not their mess, I left that exactly where it was. I cleaned my own space. My room. My bathroom. My corner of the kitchen. I threw away the old food in the fridge, washed the dishes that had piled up, wiped down the counters. By the third day, I didn't even think about them anymore. They'd sent photos, of course. Melissa couldn't help herself. She'd posted a dozen pictures of the airport, a regional terminal that had clearly never seen an international flight, the plane, a prop plane with a cracked window, and the hotel, a building that looked more like a converted motel than anything European. But I didn't look at the photos. I didn't respond to the texts. I didn't answer the calls. I just waited. Because I knew exactly what was waiting for them. And I knew that soon they'd remember that phone call I never answered. They'd need me. And I wouldn't be there. The first sign of trouble came on the fourth day. I was sitting in my room, reading a book, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa, followed by a dozen more in quick succession. Vera, why aren't you answering? This place is weird. The Europe sign is spelled wrong. Vera, please call me. The hotel is a shed. Vera, I'm scared. I read the messages and set the phone down. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't even feel guilty. Because I'd already done everything I could. I'd warned them. I'd tried to save them from themselves. And they hadn't listened. Now it was time to let them learn. The first photo arrived at 8:47 a.m. on the fifth day. It was a selfie of Melissa standing in front of a wooden sign that read EuroVillage in faded, peeling paint. The E was slightly crooked. The V had been patched with what looked like duct tape. Behind her, I could see a cluster of low, grey buildings that might have been charming if they hadn't been so obviously run down. A dirt road stretched into the distance. There were no cars. No people. Just an endless expanse of brown fields and grey sky. Melissa's caption read, "We made it. A little rustic, but that's the real Europe, right? #authentic #off beaten path #EuroVillage." I zoomed in on the photo, looking for any sign of the place they thought they were visiting. No Eiffel Tower. No canals. No cobblestone streets. Just a dirt road, a handful of sad buildings, and a sign that looked like it had been hand-painted by someone who'd never actually seen Europe. I didn't reply. I didn't even smile. I just set the phone down and went back to my book. The second photo came 3 hours later. It was a picture of the hotel. I use the term loosely. It was a cinderblock building with a corrugated metal roof, the kind of structure you'd find in an industrial park or a particularly desperate construction site. The windows were holes covered with plastic sheeting. The door was a sheet of plywood propped against the frame. The caption read, "Our room. It's very authentic. #rustic #Eurotravel #adventure." I could almost hear the desperation in her words. The way she was trying to convince herself and her followers that this was all part of some grand, exotic adventure. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I closed the app and went back to what I was doing. The text started that evening. "Vera, this place is really weird. There's no one here. Like, no one. The tour guide says the locals are shy, but I think there are no locals. The food is so bad. I think I'm getting sick. Vera, please call me. Vera, I'm really scared." I read each message as it came in. I didn't respond. I didn't acknowledge. I just watched the messages pile up, one after another, like grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. And then the messages stopped. Not because they'd given up, but because something else had started. The first call came at midnight. I was already in bed, drifting toward sleep, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw my mother's name on the screen. I let it ring. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. A few seconds later, it rang again. Then again. Then a third time. I silenced the phone and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. 3 from my mother. 6 from my brother. 8 from Melissa. And 1 voicemail. I listened to it while I made coffee. My mother's voice was thin and strained, stretched taut by fear. "Vera, honey, I know you're busy, but I really need you to call me back. This place isn't right. It's not what we thought. The hotel is, I can't even describe it. And the people here, they're not, I don't think they're actually." A crash in the background. A muffled shout. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Vera, please. I'm scared. The call ended. I took a sip of coffee. It was good. The kind of good that came from taking your time, from doing things properly, from not rushing through life to please other people. I set the phone down and didn't call back. The first message came a few hours later. Vera, we got you a lovely gift from the EuroVillage. Hope you enjoy it. Followed by a photo. It was a hand. A disembodied hand, sitting in a cardboard box, surrounded by packing peanuts. The hand was small, the fingers curved slightly inward, the nails painted a pale pink that I recognized. It was my mother's hand. I could tell by the wedding ring, the same one she'd worn for 40 years, the one my father had bought her at a flea market and she'd never taken off. The hand was attached to nothing. The wrist ended in a clean, surgical cut. I stared at the photo for a long time. Then I put down the phone and walked to the bathroom to be sick. I made it to the toilet and threw up everything I'd eaten that day. When I was done, I sat on the cold tile floor and tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. My mother's hand. In a box. Sent to me like a warning, like a promise. I'd known this was coming. I'd known they were in danger. But I hadn't expected this escalation, this brutal, irreversible proof that the trap I'd allowed them to walk into was far worse than anything I'd imagined. And yet, even then, through the shock and the nausea and the horror, I felt a small, cold part of myself say, this isn't about you. This is about them. And they made their choices. I got up, washed my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same. I didn't look like someone who'd just seen her mother's severed hand. I just looked like me. I could keep being that person. Or I could become someone else. The second photo came 2 days later. This time, the box was larger. The packing peanuts were still there, but they'd been pushed aside to make room for 4 hands. 4. Arranged in a neat row, like specimens in a museum display. The largest one had a faded tattoo on the wrist. A snake that looked like it had been drawn by a drunk friend in a high school parking lot. My brother's. The second one had a wedding ring similar to my mother's, but thinner, newer. My father's. The third had long nails with chipped red polish. Melissa's. And the fourth. The fourth was tiny. Child-sized. A small hand with soft, unblemished skin. A child's hand. My nephew's hand. I stared at the photo for so long that my phone screen went dark. I unlocked it. Stared some more. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a message. And it was saying, if you don't help them, they won't be the only ones who pay. I felt the cold hand of fear settle over my heart. They knew about Zach. They knew about my nephew. They knew, or they guessed, that the family's only leverage was the child they'd been using against me all along. I looked at the photo one more time. Then I opened the messaging app and typed, "What do you want?" The reply came within minutes. "You know what we want." I stared at the screen. And then, for the first time, I made a choice I couldn't take back. I know. But I also know you're not going to kill them. If you kill them, you lose your leverage. You lose your bargaining chip. You have nothing left. A long pause. Then the reply. "You are very smart. But you are also very wrong. We don't need them alive. We just need to prove that we're willing to go through with it." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were right. They didn't need my family alive. They just needed me to believe they'd kill them. And I did believe that. I believed it with every fiber of my being. I typed, "What do you want me to do?" The reply was instant. "Come to EuroVillage. Bring the money. And bring yourself." I stared at the screen. I could feel my heart pounding, could feel the pulse thrumming in my temples. I knew what they were asking. I knew it was a trap. I knew that if I went to EuroVillage, I might not come back. But I also knew that if I didn't go, my family was dead. I didn't love them. I couldn't. After everything they'd done, everything they'd taken from me, I couldn't bring myself to feel any warmth for them. But I couldn't let them die. Not like this. Not because of a trap I'd known about and done nothing to stop. I typed, "I'll come. But I'm not bringing the money. I'm bringing something better. The reply. And what would that be? I smiled. It was a cold smile, the kind I'd learned to wear when I was planning something. A choice. You can keep the family. Or you can have me. But you can't have both. A long pause. The longest of my life. Finally, the reply. You have 3 days. After that, we choose for you. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Not packing. Not crying. Not praying. Preparing. The kind of preparing that comes from having spent a lifetime being underestimated and using that underestimation as armor. I went to the bank and withdrew my savings, not all of it, just enough to look convincing. I bought a burner phone and a prepaid SIM card. I found my old camping gear and made sure the survival knife was still sharp. I called my friend from law school, the one who owed me a favor, and asked her to check in on my apartment every few days. You're going somewhere, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Is it dangerous? Probably. Should I call someone? Not yet. She didn't push. She'd known me long enough to know that when I decided something, I followed through. Just be careful. I promised her I would. It was a lie. But it was a necessary lie. The drive to EuroVillage took 8 hours. The road got worse the farther I went. Smooth asphalt gave way to cracked pavement, then gravel, then dirt. The landscape changed too, green fields turning brown, trees disappearing, houses thinning out until there was nothing but open space and grey sky. I didn't see any other cars. I didn't see any people. I didn't see anything that looked like Europe. But I saw the signs. Little hand-painted ones, nailed to fence posts at irregular intervals, each one pointing the way to EuroVillage. The paint was faded, the wood weathered, but the message was clear, this is where you're supposed to go. I followed them. The village appeared at the top of a hill, a cluster of grey buildings huddled together like sheep seeking shelter from a storm. It looked exactly like the photos. The peeling sign. The cinder block hotel. The dirt road. The endless expanse of nothing. I parked my car at the edge of the village, cut the engine, and sat in the silence. The only sound was the wind, the only movement the dust blowing across the road. I got out. I locked the car. I walked toward the village. They were waiting for me in the hotel lobby. The room was larger than I'd expected, a cavernous space filled with mismatched furniture and a lingering smell of mildew. The walls were bare concrete, the floor scuffed linoleum. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like dying fireflies. Scarface sat in the center of the room, a fat cigar clamped between his teeth. He was flanked by 2 men I'd never seen before, younger, meaner, carrying the kind of weapons that said they were ready to use them. The rest of the room was occupied by my family. My mother sat in a corner, her arm wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken somehow, like the ordeal had been slowly draining the life out of her. My father sat beside her, his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared at the floor, as if the cracks in the linoleum held some secret that the rest of us couldn't see. Harvey was pacing, wearing a track in the dust, his movements jerky and frantic. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate to find a way out that didn't exist. And Melissa was lying on a makeshift bed in the corner, her face grey with exhaustion, a blood-stained sheet draped over her lower body. She looked at me with hollow eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen in her face before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. They'd been through something. Something terrible. Something that had broken through all their carefully constructed walls and shown them what was really waiting for them. Vera, Scarface said, spreading his arms in a parody of welcome. You made it. I had my doubts. Here I am. Where's the money? I pulled out my bag and tossed it at his feet. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it, then at me. That's not enough. It's all I have. Then why are you here? I walked toward the center of the room, toward him, toward the heart of the trap. The 2 men tensed, ready to intervene. I walked right past them and stopped in front of my family. My mother looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Vera, I didn't think you'd come. Neither did I. You should have brought the money, Harvey said, his voice sharp and accusing. They said if you brought the money. I didn't bring the money, Harvey. I brought myself. What does that mean? It means I'm trading myself for you. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My father looked up for the first time, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in them, not gratitude, not relief, but confusion. Like he couldn't understand why I'd do this. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But, you can't. Vera, Scarface said, leaning forward, I'm not interested in you. I'm interested in money. That's the problem. You're not going to get money from them. They don't have any. I've been paying their bills for years. I've been bailing them out. I stopped myself, took a breath. I'm the only one who has money. And I'm offering it to you, if you let them go. Vera, no, my mother said, reaching for my arm. You can't. I can, I said, pulling away. And I am. It's the only way. What about Zach? Melissa asked, her voice small and trembling. What about my baby? I looked at her for a long moment. Zach wasn't with you, was he? She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. His with my mother. His safe. His not here. I closed my eyes. I had been half waiting for them to bring up the child, to try to use him as leverage. But he wasn't here. He was safe, far away from this nightmare. I wasn't sure, I said to Scarface. But I know now. You didn't send me a child's hand. You faked it. You wanted to make me panic, to make me act impulsively, to make me do something stupid. Scarface smiled. You're smart. I admire that. You're also right about one thing, I don't want them. They're useless to me now. But if you want to buy their freedom, I'll give you a price. I've already told you. No, I said, and I took a step closer to him. No, you listen to me. I'm the one who's been paying their debts. I'm the one who's been working my whole life to support them. I'm the one they've been using all along. If you want money, you want me. And I'm offering myself to you. Scarface looked at me for a long moment. Then he laughed, a deep, genuine laugh, as if I'd just told him the best joke he'd ever heard. You're really something, aren't you? I'm someone who's tired of being used. What do you want from me? Take me. Let them go. Leave this place. Take me somewhere else. Where? Anywhere. Far away. Somewhere I can start over. He studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right. I agree. The exchange happened at sunset. My family was loaded into the back of a truck and driven to the edge of the village. They were given directions to the nearest town, a few dollars, and a warning. If they ever came back, they wouldn't be leaving again. My mother tried to hug me before she left. I let her. Her body was thin and trembling, her arms too weak to hold me properly. Vera, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't understand. Good, I said. It's better that way. Are you going to be okay? I looked at her for a long moment. She was my mother. She'd given me life. She'd taken everything else. And now, at the end of it all, she was asking if I was going to be okay. I'll be fine, I said. I've always been fine. I watched them drive away, watched the truck disappear into the dust. I stood at the edge of the village, a silhouette against the setting sun, and I didn't feel anything. Not sadness. Not regret. Not relief. Just the quiet satisfaction of a plan coming together. Because they didn't know, none of them knew, that the deal I'd made wasn't with Scarface. The deal I'd made was with the men who'd been tracking him for months. The ones who were even now surrounding the village, ready to move in. The ones who'd promised me, in exchange for my cooperation, that they would let my family go, and then they would make Scarface and his men disappear. I'd known what I was doing the whole time. I'd known I was never going to be anyone's hostage. I'd known I was never going to be anyone's victim again. And as the first shouts rang out from the village, as the sound of gunfire split the evening air, I turned and walked toward the waiting car. My new life was about to begin. The sounds of the village faded behind me, swallowed by distance and the hum of the car engine. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Whatever was happening in EuroVillage, the shouts, the gunfire, the chaos, it wasn't my concern anymore. I'd done what I came to do. I'd made my choice. And I'd walked away. The driver didn't speak. He was a professional, hired by the people who'd been tracking Scarface for months. He knew his job: get me to the rendezvous point, hand me off to the next contact, and disappear. I didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. We drove for hours, through empty countryside and sleeping towns, until we reached a small airstrip in the middle of nowhere. A private plane was waiting, engines already running. The pilot gave me a curt nod and gestured to the open door. "Last one," he said. I climbed aboard and strapped myself into the worn leather seat. The plane lifted off, carrying me away from everything I'd ever known. I woke up in a different city. Not a different country. I wasn't naive enough to think I could just disappear, but a different part of the country. A new state. A new life. Everything I needed to start over was waiting for me in a small apartment that someone had rented in my name. Clothes, documents, a prepaid phone, and enough cash to get me through the first few months. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. It was sparse, utilitarian, nothing like the cluttered chaos of my old life. No family photos. No framed awards. No reminders of who I'd been. Just me. Vera. Alone. I didn't unpack right away. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank wall, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket. I wasn't tired, exactly. I wasn't sad. I wasn't relieved. I was just empty. Hollowed out. Like someone had scooped out everything I'd been carrying and left me weightless. I closed my eyes and thought about the last few days. The drive. The village. The exchange. The sound of gunfire fading behind me. I thought about my mother, standing at the edge of the village, her eyes full of confusion and fear. I thought about my father, sitting in the dust, his hands in his lap, his gaze fixed on the ground. I thought about Harvey, pacing and shouting and never once looking at me like I was anything other than a means to an end. And Melissa, lying in the corner, her face grey with exhaustion, a blood-stained sheet draped over her lower body. They'd survived. They'd walked away from EuroVillage with their lives intact, their bodies mostly whole, their debts cancelled by the chaos of the raid. But they didn't know that yet. They didn't know what I'd done. And they never would. I'd made sure of that. No one would connect me to the raid, to the informants, to the deal I'd made. I'd protected myself by making myself untraceable. Untraceable. I liked that word. It felt like freedom. Like I could finally be the person I'd always wanted to be. The first few months were hard. Not because of anything external, I had everything I needed, but because of the quiet. The endless, oppressive quiet. For years, I'd been surrounded by noise. Harvey's shouting, Melissa's demands, my mother's endless chatter. I'd hated it. But I'd also been used to it. Without it, I felt untethered. Adrift. I started going for long walks at dawn. I discovered a park near my apartment, a green space with walking trails and benches and old trees that had seen decades of change. I sat there sometimes, watching the sun come up over the horizon, trying to make sense of who I was now. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I found a job at a small law firm. Nothing fancy. Nothing like the high-powered corporate cases I used to handle. But it was honest work, and it kept me busy. I made enough to cover my rent and my groceries and the occasional coffee out. I made friends, slowly, tentatively. People who didn't know my past. People who saw me as I was now, not as the person I'd been before. And I started to build a life. The call came 6 months later. I was in my apartment, making dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. Not surprising, since I'd changed my number after the move. I let it go to voicemail. When I checked it later, I listened to a voice I hadn't heard in years. My mother's. She was crying. She was always crying when she called me. Vera, honey, it's Mom. I know you probably don't want to talk to us, but I needed to tell you something. We're okay. We're all okay. Melissa had the baby, a little girl. We named her Vera. I know that's probably not, I know we don't have the right, but we wanted to. A pause, then, I don't know if you'll ever forgive us. I don't think I could forgive myself. But I wanted you to know. I wanted you to know that we're thinking of you. And we love you. We've always loved you. The call ended. I stared at my phone for a long time. My mother's voice echoed in my head, the words, the tears, the apology, the name. Vera. They'd named the baby after me. I sat down on the couch, still holding the phone, and let the weight of it settle over me. They'd named the baby after me. After everything I'd done, after everything they'd done, they'd chosen to honor me. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe it was just guilt. Maybe it was just the way people tried to make amends when they had no other way to say they were sorry. Either way, I didn't know what to do with it. I set the phone on the table and went back to my dinner. The pasta was cold. I didn't care. I was still processing. A few weeks later, I started volunteering at a community center. It wasn't a big commitment, just a few hours a week, teaching basic financial literacy to seniors and at-risk adults. I showed them how to spot scams, how to protect their identities, how to say no when someone pressured them into something they didn't want. I wasn't doing it because I was noble. I was doing it because it gave me something to do, something to focus on that wasn't the past. But as the weeks went by, I started to see it differently. The people who came to my classes, they looked like my mother. Not the version of her I'd known, but the version of her that had existed before everything went wrong. They were vulnerable, trusting, eager to please. They wanted to believe in good things. They wanted to believe that the world was safe. And I had the chance to help them. I took it. I told my story once, at the end of a class. A woman had raised her hand and asked, "Why do you do this?" And I found myself answering, not with the careful, polished version of the truth I'd been telling myself, but with something closer to the real thing. I used to be someone who was taken advantage of, I said. I thought I was helping the people I loved, but I was really just letting them use me. And it took me a long time to realize that I deserved better. The class was silent. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to continue. Eventually, I got out. I left. And I started over. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But it was the best decision I ever made. I didn't tell them about EuroVillage. I didn't tell them about the hand in the box. I didn't tell them about the gunfire or the crash or the escape. Those things weren't for sharing. They were part of the past that had made me who I was. But I could share the lesson. The only person you can save is yourself. I decided to visit the old neighborhood. It wasn't a planned trip. I was in the city for a conference, and I found myself taking a detour past the street where I'd grown up. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown. Someone had put a for sale sign in the front lawn. I parked across the street and just sat there, looking at it. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. I was different now. I was no longer the person who'd lived in that house, the person who'd been trapped there by duty and guilt and a misplaced sense of obligation. I was free. I got out of the car and walked up to the front door. The lock was broken, left that way by the debt collectors who'd kicked it in months ago. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was empty. No furniture, no pictures, no memories. Just dust and silence. I walked through each room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen where I'd cooked for my mother. The living room where I'd watched my brother's games. The hallway where my nephew had run, laughing and shouting. And the floor. I stopped in the middle of the kitchen, the spot where I'd died. I looked down at the worn linoleum, and I didn't feel anything. Not fear. Not anger. Not sadness. Just a strange sense of closure, like a door had finally swung shut. I stood there for a few more minutes, then turned and walked out. I didn't look back. The final piece of closure came a year later. I was at the community center, setting up for a class, when a woman walked in. She was older than me, grey-haired and tired, with eyes that had seen too much. She looked familiar. "I heard you help people," she said. "People like me." I asked her name. She told me. And I realized she was the mother of one of my classmates, a woman who'd been trapped in a similar situation, manipulated by people who claimed to love her. "I don't know if you can help me," she said. "I don't know if anyone can help me. But I thought I'd try." I sat down with her. We talked for hours. And by the end of it, she was crying, and so was I. "I wish I'd had someone like you," she said. "Someone who understood." "I wish I'd had someone like me too," I said. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Really living, for the first time in my life. Not as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's scapegoat. But as myself. Vera. Just Vera. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the things my family had done to me, or the things I'd done to survive. But I could use those things to help others. And I did. Years passed. I built a career. I made friends. I fell in love with a man named Adam, a quiet, kind man who never asked me for anything I wasn't ready to give. He didn't know all of my story, not the worst parts, not the darkness, but he didn't need to. He saw me as I was, and he loved me anyway. I kept volunteering. I started speaking at conferences, sharing my story in the hopes of reaching others. I wrote a book about the dangers of predatory scams, and it found a small audience, enough to make a difference. And sometimes, late at night, I thought about my family. Not the pain they'd caused, but the strange, complicated love I still felt for them, even after everything. I didn't know if it would ever go away. I didn't know if I wanted it to. But I knew it wouldn't hurt me anymore. I'd made my peace. I'd made my peace with the past. And I'd made a future that was entirely my own. The sun was setting outside my window, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I sat on my balcony, a cup of tea in my hands, listening to the distant sounds of the city below. It had been a long journey. A difficult one. But I'd made it. I was free. Finally, completely, wonderfully free.